Hello and good afternoon. Welcome to our Thought Leadership webinar series at Buffkin Baker. My sincere hope is that you will find today's conversation not only topical, but also thought-provoking. So let's get at it for empathy in workplace. My name is Raj Das, and I head up the global transformation practice at Buffkin Baker, a retained executive search firm that focuses on technology, marketing, digital data and analytics platforms. I am joined today by my esteemed colleague, Ashley Schulman. But more importantly, I'm excited to have three phenomenal executives and dear friends as our honored panelists today. They will share their thoughts on empathy in workplace as it applies to their life journey and organizations that they head up. With us today are Sarah Corrigan from Human Resources World, David Wheaton from Pharma and Healthcare Regulatory and Public Policy Regime, and Don Patrick from Operating Data and Investment background. Since I know I will not do justice to their amazing credentials, I'm going to ask each of them to provide a brief intro on their career journeys, current role or passion, and organizational responsibilities. Let's start with you, David.
Thank you, Raj, and hello to everyone. Again, I'm David Wheaton. I'm a psychiatrist by training, but don't hold that against me. I did my medical training at Johns Hopkins and my residency in psychiatry at Tufts New England Medical Center, and have spent the better part of the past over 30 years in the pharmaceutical industry, first doing clinical development and then eventually morphing into regulatory affairs. And most recently, I was head of Global Regulatory Affairs, Patient Safety and Quality at AstraZeneca. Over the past 2 years, I've segued into semi-retirement, although it doesn't feel that way, and serve on boards of companies in the healthcare space, notably Corrigan Therapeutics, which is a small company focusing on a novel antipsychotic for schizophrenia, and Connective RX, which is a medical services company that looks at assisting patients and being adherent to treatments, particularly in the rare disease space. So I look forward to the conversation, and I'll turn it back to Raj and to my other panelists.
That's great. Don, do you want to go next?
Sure. Yeah, again, happy to be here. Thank you for inviting me. I've sort of had three distinct careers. I was first on the private equity side, spent about 10 years investing in companies, spent about 20 years actually getting together with two other colleagues, buying a company and building it up from a pretty small 40-person shop to a little bit over 3,000 people. It was mostly in the marketing and technology business. In the last sort of 10 years, I've been mostly working, helping companies grow in multiple capacities, whether that's CEO or COO or board member, et cetera. My passion is growing companies. I love the thrill of figuring out how to do that and how to align people and get them excited to go after transformational growth. And I also am excited to touch on these topics with everyone here.
Great. Sarah, a little bit about your career journeys and background.
Sure. So again, thanks for inviting me. I'm Sarah Corrigan. I started my career actually in law. So I'm a lawyer by training, practiced law in Boston for about 10 years, and then made the move to a software company, thinking that I was going to continue in law, and then ended up in human resources. I had a background in employment law, and realized quickly that I like being on the proactive side of things rather than the reactive side. So trying to avoid problems before they become problems. And so I've been in HR for 16 years now, and I love it. So I just made a move. I'm with a new company based out of Minneapolis. New position as of September, always in a manufacturing environment. And I really enjoy that. I enjoy the diversity of manufacturing. My passion absolutely is employee engagement culture. I just truly believe every statistic out there that, engagement drives success ultimately for the individual and the company. So I'm very excited to talk about empathy today.
Well, thank you so much for those wonderful backgrounds. So Corporate workplace, as we all know, has been going through significant transformation for several years now. Pandemic of 2020 has accelerated that trend probably manyfold. Satya Nadella, the CEO of Microsoft, recently said that pandemic condensed the 2 years of digital transformation at Microsoft in 2 months. We have seen evolution of remote teams and lines blurring between home and work over the last several months. My good friend Eric Yuan's Zoom platform, on which we are today, has not only become one of the most valuable companies in the world, but a word in dictionary. I don't think any of us could have fathomed that even a year ago. Given these trends, how does a company like yours sustain its corporate culture while growing and retaining its talent base? What role does empathy play in your organizational design and planning? How is productivity impacted through these transitions, and how are you addressing it? I would love for you to give any concrete examples if you can. I think it'd be very helpful to understand some of the frameworks around these. So let me first turn to Sarah to start us off with her thoughts.
Well, you ask a lot of questions there, Raj, so we may have to dial it back and take them one at a time, because I don't, if I tried to answer that, I wouldn't have any time. There wouldn't be time left for Don and David, so I don't want that to be the case. So I guess let's start with pandemic for us. Just such a huge impact on what's going on, and I can speak to 2 different experiences, because obviously I was with my former company, which is a small manufacturing company in Massachusetts, 600 employees. And then now with this larger company that I joined that's based out of Minneapolis. So complicated, because you have in a manufacturing environment employees that are working on site, and then employees who have been forced to work remotely. So many instances where empathy is required in that scenario. There's the fear of the pandemic. There's the impact on people's home life. There's a lot of strong feelings one way or the other about the pandemic itself, what you can and can't tell people to do at work. And so it's just so many, it's created so much anxiety and so much, fear and frustration, and, that it's really elevated the need for empathy to a level that I don't think I've seen in the whole time I've been doing HR. So, just my personal experience has been that need for empathy has, escalated to an incredible point at a time when people probably are least able to be empathetic because they're going through all of these crazy things themselves. So I think it's a great discussion to have, because it's been, such a unexpected transition, and one I think which leaders certainly were completely unprepared for. So that's at least an opening comment there.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. And it's interesting, Sundar Pichai at Google, I think just said a couple of days ago that he's worried that if the employees will be remote at Google for the rest of this year, that there will be incredible dislocation of corporate culture at Google that may actually never be redeemed. So it's, David, I'd love for you to speak to that, because I actually thought larger companies were able to adapt with their resources much better to what has been happening around pandemic in terms of remote work, corporate culture, whereas younger, smaller companies had a much harder time because they still were trying to formulate that culture. How do you see all of that, panning out over the next few years?
Well, that's a good question, Raj. And I wouldn't say that it's not necessarily that different for large versus small companies for this reason. While a larger company may have a more instilled and embedded culture that's been there for a while, you still have a number of new individuals coming into the organization. In the case of the pandemic, they never have a face-to-face with any other person with whom they work. It's all via Zoom. So you don't have that ability to impart in a face-to-face way. the nature of the culture, the receptivity of the culture, the, sort of, we're glad to have you on board. And I hearing from a lot of new people coming into the workforce, they are missing that sort of indoctrination, that sort of onboarding. And I think that's one where empathy comes to play. You have to recognize that a new employee, a new person on your team may need a little bit more attention, phone call, more frequent Zooms, in order to instill in them a welcome sort of attitude as they come on board. The other thing that I'm noticing with large corporations that are global, now that everyone's essentially working from home, there are no limits in terms of how long you work, what time you might be expected to be on a teleconference or a Zoom. So for example, many people are starting their days at 6 or 5 in the morning to accommodate Europe or to accommodate Japan, and working until 8, 9 at night. So people are actually working harder, and that's having even a greater impact on families. And so again, going back to the empathy subject or topic here, managers need to find ways to instill that ability to close the computer, to shut down, to take the time, even if you're sitting at home in your pajamas, but you still need to be able to take the time to deal with your family, to deal with the issues that you need to deal with in your personal life. And so I welcome other thoughts on that as well.
No, absolutely. And Don, I know, having visited your facility in New York City, Fluent, so many times, how important that culture was to you all, and and that warmth and the camaraderie, and just walking in and feeling just incredible, being everyone together. I mean, how have you all coped with all of this, and what does it mean in the future?
Yep. So the great thing about going last is I just get to agree with Sarah and David. But if you think about it, we went within less than 12 hours, we went from everyone coming into an office, 4 offices, 200 people, 250 people, to no one being in the office, right? So we sort of shifted to crisis, and then I think we shifted to change. And I think we're just starting to get to this transformational piece. So what I mean by change is, how do you help with the schedule? How do you make sure that people have to get the kids off to school, that they could block times off that they need to block off, or a mental health day? How do we start to look at things differently? The transformational piece, we're in the midst of our strategy week where we kick off the year. We have 250 people. 50 people have never been in a Fluent office. Right? So you think about what David said, how do you connect with them? How do you bring on the values that we believe? How do you make sure that they get the coaching and the mentoring and the things that they would normally have in the office that would come sort of natural? And we're in that third phase. We're still trying to figure out the transformation. We're trying a whole bunch of different things, from some structured to some sort of ad hoc. We have this, click to connect, where anybody can come on 1 hour a week and just connect to anybody across the company to meet them and start a dialogue, much like the lunchroom, right? But going back to sort of what Sarah was saying, empathy has always been, all great leaders and all great managers have always had empathy, right? They've had great empathy, they've been very transparent, and they've been authentic, right? And I think the word you used, Sarah used, escalation, I think, right? The empathy, the ability to be empathetic has accelerated to be so important right now, right? And the complexity of that is what's daunting. So if we have a 25-year-old person who's in a 600 square foot apartment in New York, how do I help them versus how do I help a mother of 2 who's living in Kansas City that has to worry about homeschooling and things like that, right? And there's all sorts of the complexity, the empathy, and your ability to put yourself in different positions to try to understand them, to help them, is what's really challenging, I think, great leaders and managers right now, right? Leaders like to find one thing to rally around and go. This is very specific to individuals. So to me, it's a fascinating time, but that being empathetic was one of the key things, and I think it's now the most important thing for a leader right now.
Let's just stay on the topic, and of course, feel free, anyone, to jump in with other thoughts. I definitely don't mean to dominate, but it's just staying on this particular framework. I would love to explore the interplay of empathy with productivity. So we have all been talking for a while about the important role of EQ, which is emotional quotient, versus IQ in managing the workplace of future. And I think the important word there I used was talking. Talking versus doing is a very different thing. Yet we are all subject to the bottom line profit drivers of our business in a capitalistic system. Do you see a conflict between these two forces, and how do you deal with it? Let me ask David to go first this time.
Well, I mean, I think that's a very good question. And you always have that tug, push, pull of driving productivity, trying to be as efficient and as cost effective as you possibly can be, while at the same time being empathetic and recognizing you can only push an individual or a team to a certain degree. And how do you balance that? One of the things that I've used in my career is to sit down with my team, or a group of individuals in my broader team, and have them tell me in an objective and open and honest way what they believe they can do in X time frame. And then we have an open discussion about it. And I would be very frank with them and say, look, the senior managers really expect that we can, in my case, deliver this submission to the FDA in 4 months. Now, we can't go back and say we have to take 3 years to do it, because we'll be laughed out of the office. So let's find that middle ground that we can actually defend with facts and data, that by doing this in this time frame with this set of resources, you can expect this result. And that, I think, it allows people to feel they control their lives somewhat. They're not being told that they have to do X. They are part of this, deciding that they will do it and how they will do it and the time frame in which they will do it is a completely different conversation. And at the end of it, everyone is aligned and feels very good and very productive and wanting to accomplish the goal and actually achieve an even faster or more productive goal than perhaps we put on paper. Very different team dynamic from just simply having that imposed upon them.
And Sarah, how do you communicate that to rank and file who may not understand that, hey, yes, you may have family and personal priorities, but if the company is not doing well and we're not generating profit, then you will not have your job. The company won't be around. I mean, how do you communicate that to rank and file?
Well, I mean, I think that what's interesting for us is, I think that for the reasons that we've discussed already today, the impact on our production employees has probably been a little less in terms of the balancing working from home, all of the extra time that I think is being created by working from home. And I'll get to that in just one second. But to answer your question, their schedules have remained the same. So other than overtime, which some people are appreciating because we also have had some downtime, furloughs, things like that, I don't see any resistance there. I think on the other side of it, though, the work from home piece, what's really, I think, complicated things is it is taking longer to get things done. And you have people who argue that they are more productive from home, and that might be the case, but my experience is that it does take a little longer to get things done because you can't just walk down the hall and catch somebody for a 2-minute conversation. You have to set up at least a 15-minute block of time because that's how your calendar works, right? And generally, you feel like if you're only setting up 15 minutes, then maybe you're being rude because you don't have time to be empathetic, which is to ask them how their family is and ask them how things are going. And you want to do that, so you make it a 30-minute call. Before you know it, you're on the phone for, to David's point, it could be, 10 hours. And so I think that's where, I see some productivity challenges, as I think people feel like they have to do that. And we have to be better at saying, I loved in fact, I wrote down, David, your comment on, closing the computer. I think maybe as leaders, we have to encourage that more because, otherwise I think there's a risk that people will get burned out eventually.
Don, is this all a temporary phenomena with the pandemic, or do you think this EQ and this emphasis on feeling at one with your entire workforce is here to stay in the future, or we're going to forget all about it once all of us are vaccinated?
I think it's like everything else that happened with the pandemic. It accelerated things that were going to happen anyway, like e-commerce. We've done more e-commerce in this past year than we did 10 years previously. Same thing with employees and the empathetic and the empathy piece. I think, so if you think through, if you buy into my three things around empathy, transparency, and being authentic, I think what Sarah was bringing up and Dave was bringing up, now it's around health. Right? How do you make sure the employees are healthy? And that's a mental health and physical health, right? And that's where, when we talked about just the starting of this process, and we're still in this transformation, how can we help employees that, quite honestly, most of us are in a 24/7 job, right? And things never turn off. And how do you help them turn off? And how do you help them give time off? Or how do you help them block time periods? I mean, a year and a half ago, if a dog barked in the background or someone came behind you in a Zoom call, you maybe would get upset or say, it's not very professional. Now it's normal. If I'm on a Zoom call and I don't see a kid or I don't see a dog, it's like not even part of the equation. It has to be part of the equation right now. So the point you made about culture, again, I think is where Jess at the beginning. If you grew 20% a year for each year, after 4 years, you have half the workforce is new, right? And that's the thing that I think we're just going to have to start to tackle. Is how do we keep that culture that's so easy that we know how to do it in person and in an office? How do we make sure that happens and gets instilled in every new employee that comes into the company? So we've had to force people to take time off, right? Literally, we had to say, you need to take up. We've given leaves of absence for people for like up to a month. We've told people they had to take the weekend off and told them to go somewhere on our dime. We've told, people that had to deal with family issues that, we're going to cover for your job, right? But I think David said it right. The workplace is no longer 8 to 6, right? If people start at 5 and go off at between 8 and 10 while they're getting the kids off to school, and after dinner we'll have Zoom calls between 8 and 12. That is how we're dealing with it right now, but that cannot continue, right? I think everyone on this call knows, I don't know how you guys feel, but at the end of the day, thinking there's Zoom is, you have to get another Zoom call is like sticking needles on your thumbs. You're just, I can't take another Zoom call. So part of that is helping the employees realize that, hey, you don't have to say yes to every meeting. You can take time off. If there's more than 5 people on this meeting, you don't have to be there. You can have someone else be there for you. So that's the helping people get through this, rather than if I send out a meeting request, think they have to come to it because I'm senior to them. Right.
We've also found, over this has been a trend has been going on for the last couple of decades, right, where workers are leaving companies at much faster pace than they did, 30, 40, 50 years ago, because they don't feel the same loyalty to the companies that they work for. And the pandemic with the remote work situation, you think that has that accelerated it? Because what's the resiliency now for someone not even going to a physical workplace? Because they could easily shift job from a company A to B to C by just being at their home.
Absolutely. Yep. I think if you do not have a strong culture, and as everyone knows, it's the manager, right? Because people leave managers, they don't leave companies. If you don't have strong managers that know how to help people, you're going to have higher turnover in this environment.
And to build on that, Raj and Don, that's an excellent question. And one of the things I'm wrestling with is, how do you ensure that people are developed in this new paradigm that we're in now? And by develop, I mean not simply given new experiences, but also they're expecting to be promoted. And that whole discussion around promotion, who's ready, what are the qualities, that kind of conversation that you'd have sitting around the table normally in a conference room, that's going to be very different in terms of what you base those conversations on. Because you see a very different person across the Zoom versus when you see them in a meeting room or walking down the hall or in the coffee break area. And that's going to be a real challenge. And that goes to your point about people leaving because they can get promotions by going to another company as opposed to being developed and promoted within their current company. That, I think, will be another challenge in this new paradigm.
Yeah,
Sarah
I
mentioned-
almost wonder whether that's going to cause us to, I think perhaps you're going to see, a redefinition of, performance expectations and, because, we're already seeing this phenomena happening. All of a sudden, somebody who used to have to come to the office is working virtually, which means they can work for anybody anywhere. And, that is a real challenge. And so, I think that we are going to have to not only figure out ways to engage those employees and build a virtual culture, but I think we're also going to be changing our performance expectations off of that. How do you succeed in a virtual culture as opposed to being physically in the workspace? So that's pretty interesting.
Absolutely. Well, now I'm going to turn over the conversation over to my colleague Ashley to continue the discussion.
Raj. So everybody's already really touched on this, but what do you think the role of leadership in promoting that culture of empathy is going to be? And do you think that change will require a new generation, or do you think that current leaders are, up to that task?
So I'm going to start. I'll start first and then let these guys tell me where I'm wrong. I don't think leaders have any. They have to do this, so they're not going to survive, right? So much like diversity and inclusion, right? Much like brands, where consumers are demanding things of companies to be radically different from not only from who they stand for, like Dick's Sporting Goods not selling drugs or selling guns, to to who you stand for and who you don't stand for. That has forced companies and CEOs and leaders to think differently about the business. And employees are going to force leaders to do the exact same thing, right? So if you don't, what's going to happen is you're going to see a lot of turnover. You're going to see profits go down, because we know that that's a lagging indicator. If great people leave, profits go down, and then they're not going to be there, right? So I think we have no choice as leaders but to figure this out, not only but amongst ourselves, but amongst our teams, the teams underneath us, to make sure that permeates every piece of the organization, right? It with Fluent, it's somewhat easier now because we have 250 people. And Sarah, you said when you went work from home, we actually got more productive, because we'd been together for a long time. We knew each other, but what we realized is that innovation and those teachable moments and the coming out of meeting room and sitting there and saying, hey, you missed this point, this way I do. We lost that coaching edge and we lost that innovation edge, right? That's what we're starting to feel the sort of effects of that right now. So, but specifically your question, if leaders can't adapt and change and quickly, they're not going to be in their position very long.
Yeah, I would agree with what Don said, and I would add that new approaches to leaders reaching deep into the organization will have to be employed. I mean, one of the things I sort of prided myself about is I did a lot of walking around, and folks in my organization, not just my direct reports, but throughout the organization, saw me on a regular basis. And that was a way of establishing some human contact. So in this era of Zoom, where everything has to be scheduled, the challenge will be, how does a leader reach out to the broad organization, set up time, but also don't have them freak out because the senior vice president is saying, I want to talk to you for 15 minutes, because that also creates a bit of a reaction as well. So we really have to modify our approaches to ensuring that everyone in the organization feels seen, heard, touched. And again, going back to what we were talking about earlier, that really helps build the culture as well.
Yeah, and I think so I agree with everything, that Don and David have said. And I would just add, Ashley, that you asked, do we need a new generation to accomplish this? And I don't believe that. I personally believe that you know, the amount of empathy that you have sometimes is genetic. I think you either, you know, have a lot or maybe you don't, but it doesn't mean that you can't develop some empathy skills. And, you know, we work hard with our leadership development work to make sure that that's something that we focus on. So active listening skills and, you know, making sure that you do start your meetings by asking how people are doing, that you do, you know, an emotional check-in, as well as, you know, wondering what you really want to know is your project done, you know? So instead of like turning on the phone and saying, Ashley, where is the project? You know, how are you doing? And so, you know, it may be something that, you know, using a camera, making sure that your camera's on so that you can actually read body language, which is so important to, you know, empathy. So I think it's something that can be taught and you know, achieved at some level, but it may be something that, you know, companies that aren't doing that have to focus on in order to, you know, achieve the type of success that that we've been talking about.
And
Yeah, I
so
mentioned it.
Ashley may have been referencing, you know, like in the business schools, you always taught this command and control leadership style of corporate America CEOs. And maybe she was referencing that, like, you know, does that need to go away for us to adapt to this new world? And whereas when I am talking to my teenager son and daughter, I feel like every time I talk to them, I learn something new because their minds are so open and so transparent and so adaptable to the worlds that we live in, whereas some of us that grew up in the older generation are set in our ways. Is that going to be a handicap for us?
Well,
For
it's
me,
probably the oldest one on this panel. I can probably.
The youngest looking though.
I wouldn't call it set in our ways. I would say, and this sort of goes to this dynamic that you see play out in the workforce. You know, there's a role for everyone across the entirety of the age spectrum in terms of the workforce, and experience speaks for a lot. And that experience also means that for you to have been successful in going through the various roads of career development that all of us have gone through, you've had to modify your approach one way or another. So that skill set is well embedded in the more mature, more experienced people. So I think it really is not just for the young to be able to accommodate the Zoom culture. Older people can as well. We're all successfully got on this panel without any IT support. So I think this really, hopefully, will reinforce the need to have a full panoply of age represented on teams, because everyone has something of value to bring to the table. And from an empathy standpoint, it may be easier for those of us that have gone through a lot of difficult circumstances to empathize with a younger employee that's going through that with kids, with death in the family and that sort of thing. And I think that really will speak a lot towards reestablishing that connection and the empathy and the culture with those sorts of connections happening across the age spectrum.
Wonderful. I agree. And then as far as, you know, the role of empathy in promoting greater diversity, equity, and inclusion, do you think that corporate America will drive a more just and equitable society for, you know, everybody, kind of speaking to that representation of all age groups and everything?
I'll start. I much like I said before, I don't think corporations have a choice anymore. I think the consumers are forcing companies to look at things differently, and if they don't, they vote with their wallet and decide not to work with them, right? And I think employees are doing the exact same thing, right? How much you give back to community, how much you what is the diversity of your workforce? What are you improving? What kind of training are you providing? I think it's demanding, it's being demanded of the corporations, and they don't have a choice. That's the good news, right? The good news is if you're going to be an outlier, it's your brand and your company is going to suffer. We've always done a lot of things around community service. We've always given a lot back to the community because we were mostly New York City bound, and we wanted to give things back. Even with the amount of, we gave over $1 million back last year to the community, even with the pandemic and things that are going on, it was just important to our employees to show that even in a bad year, we were doing things that could help others, right? That was sort of clearly a cultural thing that we had to make sure that we were stepping that up. Given that our business was running relatively well in this bad situation, how do we help others, right? That cultural piece and who we stand for and who we bring on, and I think is something that plays a critical role. And people consumers will either decide to work with you because you're doing the right things, or employees will decide to work for you if you do.
I apologize if you heard the helicopter flying over. We're on the flight path for the vice president's house, and so we have helicopters flying over all the time. So,
well, that's a nice flight path, David.
Unless there's something wrong, but yeah. I want to build on what Don was saying around diversity and inclusion and having a workforce that reflects the community in which we all exist. I think the challenge that we will have going forward in this new world is reinforcing for managers ways of looking in an innovative way for people that don't look like them, don't sound like them, don't come from the same experiences as they do. Because the most easy default is to tap someone that you know, that you went to school with, and that tends to be a lot how people get brought into the workforce and get promoted and that sort of thing. So we have to challenge managers to not do that as the default, to broaden the perspective, broaden your mindset, and look for someone that actually may make you feel a little bit uncomfortable, because that is the way you will grow your workforce in a way that's reflective of the community.
But Sarah,
I think I'm going to even add another ring, because I love the way this conversation's going. So I agree completely with everything that Don and David had said. I'll take it one step further in that even within our existing employee base, I think that this discussion adds another level of complexity when you talk about empathy. So for me, I don't mind admitting that, I've prided myself on driving empathy as a competency that our leaders should have and managers should have. But I always feel like I'm successful if I can get to a point where the manager stops and listens about the circumstance, right? Have some empathy with respect to whatever's happened right at that moment and the conversation that you're having, or like we've discussed earlier, how are things at home going, so showing some. But I think what we're talking about here is even another level of awareness and another, I think to David's point, looking beyond, looking for, what this employee's experience has been and how that's impacted where they've come to that moment, and trying to have a stronger awareness of the DE&I factors that have influenced, that path and that journey. And so I think that's something that, we'll be using and we'll be trying to, strengthen as a tool for our managers, because I think it could change the outcome of conversations, and I think it could change the outcome of the employee's experience at work with existing employees, in addition to looking to improve, strengthen our DE&I as we look for people to join our team.
You think this trend in bringing more diversity and inclusion in corporate America, as David was saying, representative of the communities where these companies are domiciled, will that progression be organic and natural, or will that require, some sort of forceful commands from either from the government or from people that have deep pockets of money? So for instance, in California now, if the company is domiciled in California, they have a requirement for how many female directors are required in publicly traded companies on the board. And if you don't have, that's a direct legislation from the government. And then the funds, like the CalPERS of the world, are saying they are not going to invest in public companies if they don't see diversity in corporate boards. how do you see all this panning out longer term? And then what other thing that puzzles me, that we have been kind of hearing about these for several years, but when you look at the representation of corporate boards and CEOs of Fortune 500, it doesn't seem like a lot of progress, even in like last 5 years. Like, what's holding all of this back?
Well, I'll throw myself on the funeral pyre here. Having been through that experience, as I said, I serve on 2 boards now. I think companies are moving in that direction. They are actively engaging search organizations that specialize in diverse populations to bring a diverse representation to the board table. The challenge is, and this goes back to what we've always struggled with in this country, you want to make sure that in addition to being a female, or in addition to being Black or Hispanic or whatever that additional characteristic may be, they also have the work experience, the sort of experiential sort of component that brings some value to the table. No one wants to sit at the table. I do not want to sit at the table as a token. That is just not acceptable. So you need to have that right combination of experience, diverse characteristics that really will make that experience, both for the person sitting at the table that's diverse, but also for the other board members to see that, wow, this really makes a difference. The nature of our conversations around this table have really changed with this or these individuals sitting at the table. And that's how you make change. Now, going back to the pandemic and empathy, one of the things we're going to be faced with very soon, we have a generation of young people that are finishing high school and college in bizarre circumstances. And I fear that, particularly in STEM education, the science education, we're going to have a dearth of good people, particularly from diverse backgrounds, that can begin to go into industries that gives them the experience to be able to be a candidate for board positions when they're my age. And that I'm very fearful about. And that's one of the other things we'll have to wrestle with as a result of this new paradigm, both from an educational standpoint as well as a workforce standpoint.
Yeah, your point you bring up, David, I'm actually
May have lost
Did I freeze up
Don
here on you guys?
temporarily, hopefully.
Yep, sorry about that. Yep. Can you hear me now?
Yeah,
I can hear you.
you're back.
Okay, great. So I think your point you bring out, David, 5 years from now, 10 years from now, when that high schools and the college kids are looking for jobs, how do we deal with that? And how do we make sure we provide that training?
Sorry, Don, you broke up again.
So I'll jump in here and I'll rescue Don while he's reconnecting. I don't think I'll have probably as astute a point as he was going to make, but I completely agree with where this conversation is going. But I also do think that there is going to be some value also to take some time and reassess those qualifications. So, I'm a big believer that, if I look at David as a medical professional, there are certain skills and experiences that he has to have in order to do that job. But I also think that, for some reason that we have to examine, we also, and I'll throw our company into this bucket, have qualifications that we've added to this list that perhaps aren't necessary, or perhaps can be, achieved in another, have been achieved in a manner which isn't traditional. So, I think that it's looking at both of those things, and I have the same fear about, the school system. I think there was a problem to that point already before the pandemic even started. I think this is just going to exacerbate it.
Don, there was anything that you wanted to add before we lost you?
I had the most intelligent points that I was going to make all hour, so you guys sort of missed all that. The joke is I'm in a first world country with a third world cell and internet service down here in Florida, so I apologize. Sorry about that. It goes out with the wind, so.
Yeah, no, yeah, I think that some of the points, just taking some notes here, like that David started off with, look, I think the bottom rung of the society has gotten absolutely crushed, through this pandemic. And that was a trend that was happening with this, gap in income between the, top percentiles and the bottom has gotten much, much worse. And how do we make up for that? And when you talk about diversity and inclusion and having a more just and equitable society longer term, this pandemic has definitely not helped. It has really hurt us really bad. I mean, you have one phenomena where NASDAQ is at absolute peak, and there have been, I think, over $2 trillion of net worth has been added to billionaires' wealth, over last, year, whereas you have people that are fighting for food. So, and to Sarah, to your point, just to summarize that piece, what we find in our business is that companies ask for diverse leaders and female leaders. But then when it comes down to it, what David was saying was they look at the same traditional, metrics, which is like, do you have 25 years of experience of being a COO? Have you worked in Fortune 500 company being a COO? Well, you're not going to have someone who is a female and someone who is of a diverse background of 25 years experience. Well, that's why we need to take it to the next level. So you have to relax some of those metrics if you want a more just society longer term. Otherwise, it's not going to happen, at least in our lifetimes. We may have to wait another 25, 30 years.
And what's interesting, Raj, when you actually sit at the board table or you sit at senior leadership tables, that 25 years of COO experience doesn't necessarily pan out in terms of value sitting around the table. I mean, there's obviously some value there, but the discussions really are based more around human experience and clear thinking and sort of being able to assess a risk and make a decision. And that is something that could be, as Sarah was saying, could be garnered in a whole host of ways, not just serving as an SVP or a COO for 25, 30 years. And so, what are the tools that we can utilize and give managers to utilize to pull that out such that there's comfort with making a pretty aggressive decision in terms of someone that may not look, think, and act like you, but can bring great value to the table. And those are tool kits that we need to establish and give to managers as they go forward.
Excellent point. Well, I think we're coming up on time. So just want to see any final words of wisdom, for our audience. Maybe you can start with you, Sarah.
Oh my gosh, thanks a lot. Talk about the toughest question probably from the whole thing. Let's, just circle back to empathy. Like make it a requirement, make it something that you focus on, help people with, develop their skills, even if it's something that genetically doesn't come to them. It is extremely important. Widen that circle out so that it's empathy, not just for the circumstance in front of you, but where, the experience that the person you're speaking with has had and what's brought them to that point in time. So there you go.
Don?
I think, just to follow up on Sarah's point, I think from a empathy perspective, managers are held accountable to performance, right? And those usually are financial metrics. I think we need to have a metric around empathy. I think Sarah mentioned engaged employees, and I don't know if you do all the stuff with Marcus Buckingham and how you rank employees around that. I think it's going to be a clear metric around managers in terms of how empathetic are they and how they drive engagement for the employees, along with financial metrics. I think that's what's going to change the game.
David, any final words of wisdom?
Well, and I think to the point that Don was raising earlier, one of the challenges we'll face as we all finally get vaccinated is if, how, and when you return to some form of the workplace. And one of the issues that we've always wrestled with is there are those jobs that can easily be done from home. And there are other jobs that, at least on the surface, can't easily be done from home. So you can't have this dichotomy of employees, those that can work from home and those that must come into the office. You have to find a way to give everyone that same opportunity to make their personal decision about, I'm comfortable coming into the office or I'd rather work from home. And that should be employed across the entirety of the organization so that everyone feels that that empathy approach is applied to them as well. So I think that's another thing we need to keep in mind.
Love it. Well, that was a fascinating discussion. I'm going to recommend all three of you to Harvard Business School for a case study. And I can't wait to get my hands at it. Well, thank you again for enlightening me in so many areas that I had not even considered before. Look forward to continuing the conversation offline as well. Very grateful to our panelists, to Ashley and the audience. Cheers.
Thank you.